Welcome to the final day valedictory session of this workshop. So, in fact, I would also like to welcome you to the department. So, this is the Department of English and School of Humanities in University of Hyderabad. So, today's valedictory session will have two components. First, the valedictory lecture by Professor Pramod Nayar, followed by a panel discussion by the research scholars in the department. So I hope all the participants are here. So without further ado, I would like to begin this with a bio note on Professor Pramod Nayar. In fact, honestly speaking, this introduction needs no introduction, but still I will make an attempt to that. Okay. Professor Pramod Nayar teaches at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. His most recent works include the edited collection of From Discovery to the Civilizational Mission, English Writings on India, Alzheimer's Disease Memoirs, Poetics of the Forgetting Self, and Essays in Celebrity Culture, Stars and Styles. His essays have appeared in Modern Fiction Studies, South Asia Review, South Asia Narrative, Celebrity Studies, Asiatic, Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Prose Studies, Autobiography Studies, Biography, Image and Text, and Postcolonial Text, among others. His interests and publications span across the areas of English colonial writings on India, travel writing, human rights and narratives, post-humanism, post-colonial literature, cultural studies, literary and cultural theory, and graphic novels. He is also a regular contributor to the Telangana Today, The Wire, and India Art Today. He is also a recipient of the Visitors Award for the Best Research in the category of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences in the year 2018. So there's a long list of his achievements and accolades, but I'll pause here and I can confidently say that he is pride of our department as well. He's also the co-PI for this IWE online project. So now I would like to welcome Professor Pramod Nayar to deliver his lecture. Over to Professor Pramod Nayar.
Thank you, Noah. I'm not sure it's a very bright idea to speak in an event that we are organizing, whether we are pi or co-pi or half a pi. It seems far too self-indulgent and narcissist even for English teachers, who, as we all know, are more self-indulgent than others. But it's very rare that I would refuse an suggestion and advice and request about any matter. So that's precisely why we have chosen to inflict this on you. It's also interesting that it is valedictory, so that you really have no choice if you want your certificates but to listen. If you were on first day and the inaugural address, you might have some escape mechanism in place. But here, of course, having suffered through, journeyed through, if you want to play on suffer, here we are. The title is Situating IWE in the Age of Postcolonial World Literatures. And I have two principal sections. How much time do I have, actually? 1 hour. Okay, we'll invent something as we go along, which is mostly like our syllabus and our teaching mechanisms. Part 1 is to do with IWE postcolonial world literature, and part B, which anticipates what our better research scholars will be doing by way of the panel, new directions in researching IWE in terms of the about to citedness. So the first section, IWE postcolonial and world literatures, and I have four principal arguments to make. One, that Indian writing in English and its rising visibility is aligned with and within a similar rise in the visibility of postcolonial literature and globalization with its economic, social, and cultural productions, and finally, global postcolonial studies and readership. As in, you cannot separate IWE's global stature from the increasing curricularization of globalization studies, the inclusion within global whatever you want to call it, global South Asian studies, global South literary studies, the canonization of the post-colonial, the canonization of South Asian studies and global South studies, and of course the increasing global readership for all of these genres. I'm not separating out genres and media, comics and graphic novels, film, literature at this point in time. But overall, the emphasis is, I think, on all cultural productions coming out of the global South. And I have a couple of things to say about this in a couple of minutes. And just as we cannot conceive of world literature without globalization, given the fact that world literature by definition is global, we also cannot think of either the early history of Indian writing in English or its contemporary frame without situating it within a history of global cultural production and consumption. And this is, to me, at least a significant point, because the ways in which IWE is consumed now is an amplification of how it has been produced and consumed in the past. It's not radically distinct, is what I want to propose. Think of Deen Muhammad, often credited as the first Indian author in English. But that he was an author is incidental to what he actually was. Officially appointed as the shampooing surgeon to King George III. Also the author of the first manual on shampoos. The text exists. He founded the shampoo bathhouse in England. Interesting character, ran away with his neighbor's wife, was appointed to the man often identified as the Mad King of England, George III, the subject of Byron's Vision of Judgment and other texts. And the codification of Deen Muhammad as an author in English stems from the fact of his location. Then think of Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Victorian England. We are told, this is apocryphal, that the Lord Chancellor could not get an appointment to meet Raja Ram Mohan Roy because so many of the English ladies of the upper crest were waiting to meet him. And he is apparently said to have recorded that I really don't understand why all these white upper class women want to meet this dark-skinned native. Apocrypha. Also, of course, his famous debate with the Archbishop of Canterbury on the precepts of Jesus and other texts. Think of the consumption of Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Victorian England. The subject of several studies, of course. Think of Sarojini Naidu and the Dutts in England, Mulk Raj Anand and the institutionalization of literature by way of the founding of Bloomsbury, the internationalization of Tagore. All of these are precedents to how we understand IWE now. Its situatedness in the global circulation of Indian authors and Indian texts. There is also a very large number of Indian travelers to England, starting from the early 18th century, Parsi shipbuilders, lawyers and statesmen, educationists who have documents about this. If you look at Michael Fisher's work, Counterflows to Colonialism, you also discover the Indian presence in England, ayahs, lashkars, midwives, all sorts of nurses, sailors, and of course the upper class of Indians who traveled. Notably among them would be Ramesh Chandra Dutt, Dadabhai Naoroji, and all these other later travelers. So it's odd to think of IWE as arriving suddenly on the scene, which would be a definition of an event. No, IWE in the world context was always in process. It is an amplified iteration, like I said, of a process that has been initiated for some time now. And the authors whom I have mentioned were always already consumed, not just because of tuberculosis, which is the other meaning of the term consumption, as you know, no? In England. And it's not only mathematicians, but scientists of various kinds, literary figures like Sarojini Naidu and Tagore, who have been part of this global circulation. Then if you look across the Atlantic, you will also see other actors and actants as part of the scene. Then, of course, the pioneering women academics, lawyers, Cornelia Sorabji and others, who also make an appearance. So in the annals of global literature, the Indian presence has always been there. They may not have been award-winning, large-selling authors, no, but they were there. So IWE now, I think, benefits, even to this day and age, from its insertion into global cultural processes, which were initiated quite some time ago. And brand IWE, because it's a brand now, is inextricably linked, therefore, to brand Postcolonial. It's not possible to separate these. And about the brand Postcolonial, it's an argument I've made before in my book of the same title, 2018. And what we therefore study about brand POCO works for brand IWE as well. And there are 3 or 4 things that we need to pay attention to about the branding, and I don't mean it in the sense of slaves and cattle being branded. There are 3 or 4 things we need to pay attention to in the branding of IWE. It's necessary to study the branding and exploration, the celebritydom of IWE authors, the culture of celebrity that has come up around these globally consumed texts. We know arguably that Tagore was one of the first to have that kind of iconic global presence. Then you have the very strong connections, Edwin Arnold writing about India, Rowan Roland's connections with Gandhi, texts and people that circulate. And IWE author celebritydom, amplified again in the late 20th and early 21st century, is worth studying. This would include the study of the Indian author in English self-representation. There's work that is possible and has been done in some small ways about the kinds of interviews they give, the self-fashioning of the Indian author in English by way of their websites. Think of someone like Ashok Bankar, Devdutt Patnaik, their self-representation, and also the representation by their publishers such as Bloomsbury, Faber and Faber, the diasporic authors like Daljit Nagara and others, and how they have been transformed into global icons. There are problems, of course, with how that is being done, and we'll come to that in a minute. We also need to examine how, and that's the third strand of examining brand IWE, we should examine how events and factors of cultural production, such as literary festivals and awards, construct canons of Indian writing in English. Which texts, which authors get focused upon, and why? Graham Huggan, when he wrote his early book on the post-colonial exotic, made the first move towards this kind of canonization via the Booker Prize, for example. The presence of Indian authors, even in the long list, not necessarily winning, but in the long list, as contributing in many ways to the canonization of Indian authors across the world. And as James English, the interestingly named James English, he's a professor of English. So I wonder how you write that, James English, comma, English. I can understand James English, comma, chemistry, but James English, comma, English, you think there's a typo. But his work on the Literary Prize is a classic example of this kind of analysis. Also, if you look at people like John Froh writing about signatures and brands, you see this. So the branding is actually a co-production. So I would hesitate to say that it is the Booker Prize that creates a Rushdie or a Roy. It's a co-production. How we write, what kind of awards we win, what kind of Litfests we participate in, how does the Litfest showcase these authors, is part of what I'm thinking of as the cultural production of and canonization of the Indian author in English. Now, moving on from there to IWE and postcolonial literature, Robert Young makes this very interesting point that postcolonial literature is less concerned, I quote, is less concerned with aesthetic impact than making a critical intervention, an intervention that is always directed beyond the novel to the state of the world outside. I'll repeat that. Postcolonial literature is less concerned with aesthetic impact than making a critical intervention, an intervention that is always directed beyond the novel to the state of the world outside, end quote. Much postcolonial literature, as we know, is read, shall we say, topically. It's more valued for its choice and treatment of themes, and the aesthetic criteria or the formal properties of the text come in for only secondary treatment and attention. Essentially, this is putting it in fancier words, the older argument that certain literatures are available only as social documents, not necessarily as aesthetic or generic advances over a preceding generation's work. That is, you value the postcolonial text because of the social commentary it offers, because of the quote-unquote insight into social conditions, real-time conditions of, say, urban India or suburban domesticity that it offers, not necessarily for the kind of aesthetic or formal experimentation that it does, which is exactly why Midnight Children breaks the pattern. It innovates as no Indian novelist had dared to innovate before. Rushdie broke the language and reinvented it. It was unthinkable because until then, if you read Arun Joshi or Narayan or Bhavani Bhattacharya, they were writing a kind of formal prose which fits what is expected of the social realist novel. And you see that strain even now in patches of Adiga or Rohit and Mistry, which they follow the social realist pattern. But Rushdie decided to hell with it. And he broke the language. And mind you, this is the time when Marcus is doing his own little bit with magical realism. And much later, of course, Ben Okri and others will try the same with The Famished Road and other texts. But what I'm trying to emphasize is IWE falls into that same pattern, that the consumption of IWE is primarily because it represents a social document. And it comes perilously close to what Frederick Jameson early argued of third world literature as national allegory. And of course, Aijaz Ahmed's absolutely stunning response to that. That if a text doesn't serve as national allegory, would you then reject it as a text of that particular nation? And that's exactly what Rushdie set out to do. That if my text is not a national allegory as you understand allegory, then would you deny that this is an Indian novel in English? Would you say this is not adequately Indian? IWE, therefore, like postcolonial literature, is evaluated as a social document and not so much for the aesthetic criteria, nor do the writers want that level of experimentation. There are exceptions, of course. Arundhati Roy would be one. Rushdie is another. The emergence and spectacular rise of a text like Bhimayana would be one more. But they're few and far between. And the focus remains on a more conservative use of the novel as form. So that is how IWE is produced, and that's how IWE is consumed. Robert Young also makes the point that postcolonial literature is characterized by an ethics of humanity, of the humane in its broadest sense, which means that it will also be concerned, he says, with the lives of animals. And this pushes the boundaries of the postcolonial canon as well. And I will have reasons to return to this. My point is, IWE contributes to both postcolonial and global/world literatures. I'm not very sure which term to use, but it doesn't matter, I think, because I don't use either of them. IWE contributes to both postcolonial and global world literatures in the form of provincializing the global north. Postcolonial and IWE literatures are, quote, both part of a larger cultural awareness of the processes of transculturation, inspiration, exchange, and engagement that govern our cultural, political, and economic lives, like writes Eric Hyatt in his work on world literature, globalization, and postcolonialism. In short, IWE benefits from the global financial, human, and cultural flows. Nobody disputes that those cultural, economic, and human flows are uneven. It would be foolish and downright naive to think that it's anything but uneven. And yet, some benefits do accrue to literary and cultural productions. So, when we think in terms of IWE, post-colonial world literatures, it has benefited from it, it draws upon it. It is also, whether fortunately or unfortunately, consumed as another instance of the global south or another instance of the world literary canon. And that's how it has evolved, that's how it remains. We need, of course, to pay some more attention to questions of form. And I will have reasons to return to that in follows now. To me, it seems that the whole idea of IWE in terms of its situatedness ought to be more expansive. And that's what I'm trying to make a case for. And the reason is something that you would discover if you read enough of the post-colonial canon. There is no writer worth her or his salt in the post-colonial canon who isn't also reading and responding to the white male Christian canon. There is an argument that you are not ever going to be a good writer unless you are first a good reader, which is more or less true. If you look at somebody as erudite as a Rushdie or a Ghosh or a Derek Walcott, you know how steeped they are in the literatures of the world. And it's not necessarily picking specific marginal ethnic communities and will read only their literatures and attain nirvana. No. Most good authors are a bit like cockroaches. They collect a lot of stuff. And a lot of knowledge and wisdom comes out of accretion. You just put things together. And when you read someone like Walcott, I don't know whether you're aware of the fact that Walcott has 5 poems on Robinson Crusoe. 5. He can't get away from Crusoe. Arguably the single greatest 20th century post-colonial poet has to return to that. When he wants an epic, his model is Homer, and that's why he's Homeros, which is a reworking of Homer. Now, detractors will think of it as a slavish return to the master's language. Though if you know how to read your Walcott, you will understand that he is slave to nobody's language. He has mastered it himself. How does he do that? That's because of an attention not just to the canon, but its aesthetic principles and what he seeks to reinvent. You only have to look at A Far Cry from Africa, the Schooner Flight, or any of the Walcott poems. Or you look at the Ghosh canon, and you discover that. So it's important to recognize that, as Trivedi famously said, but in a very different context, that IWE is the result of a set of transactions. A set of transactions that begins in the late 18th century when Kavali Venkataboraya starts transcribing texts for Charles Mackenzie, decoding temple inscriptions, ruins for him. When the first writers are employed in Calcutta by the English East India Company, the color of all Western writing is India ink. I hope you recognize that. It's India ink. And India ink is manufactured by a co-productive process. And IWE is no exemption from that. So when we think of IWE as hermetically sealed, it's a bit of a problem. And I'm not thinking only in terms of the cultural production of the late 20th century, where the digital medium, the grand marketing strategies, and the lit fests have taken over. No, it begins as early as the late 18th century, which is the point I was making when I referred to Din Mohammed and Roy and others. That engagement with the world was always there. And you won't find authors of any worth who are not also reading those texts. So that's the first part of what I wanted to say. The second is new directions in researching IWE in terms of the above two-sidedness. The two-sidedness are postcolonial and world literatures, as I just spent some time talking about. Because of this dual situatedness, there is a need, I'm proposing, to locate IWE's genres within both postcolonial and world literary genres. When we say genres, and I'm borrowing here Weichi Dimok's argument, genres are not, quote, just as a theory of classification, but perhaps more crucially, a theory of interconnection. Genres are not necessarily dividing systems. They are also systems of connection. So to see how IWE genres have shaped up, broken the pattern, improvised on those, it requires us to locate them better in postcolonial genres as well as world literary genres. You don't separate those. You need to see them together, read them against each other. Not necessarily, to borrow the standard critical phrase, reading against the grain. I don't even know what the grain is. When people say reading against the grain, whose grain? What grain? What is the grain in your text? Why is there such a strong agricultural metaphor? I suppose it's to do with consumption. We need to look at new organizing principles, says Mariano Siskind, when looking at studying genres. For example, there are 3 ways of doing this. You bridge the different historical and geopolitical ways in which texts are inscribed, classified locally and globally within mappings made up of uneven power relations. This is basically Siskind's argument that genres travel. And they travel across, very often, uneven power relations, geopolitical connections and territories, and different geocultural formations. And they are classified locally at one point and accepted globally. Think of events and processes like prohibitions and bans and censorship of local texts, which then assume a global life of their own. What is denied them vitally, vital also means life, at a local level, sometimes fuels a global resurgence and circulation. And these mappings, these literary cartographies, are across uneven power relations. One must not forget that these uneven power relations are also to do with modes of cultural production. The conglomerates of publishing houses such as Random House, the huge power cultural that, say, Faber and Faber or W.W. Norton has. I didn't know till Sharad pointed out that the collected Aga Shahid Ali is from W.W. Norton. Think of the power of a volume like that, or that Daljit Nagara appears from Faber and Faber, a publishing house once headed by T.S. Eliot. What kind of power relation does that have as opposed to being published for Lingampalli Press, to take an example. Second, about genres, to foreground the worldly in world literary texts, that is, as Siskind puts it, discovering the universalizable potential of texts that are akin to each other. This could be common thematic requirements, common political concerns, reading, say, Palestinian poetry for political purposes, looking at the Southeast Asian Gothic tradition, which is now very strong, as political texts. The pandemic novel, I forget now what it's called, which came out just around the time the pandemic burst upon us. Chinese-American texts about migration and the building of the railroads, etc., etc. They foreground the worldly, yes. But even when those worlds are distinct, unknown and unknowable, they still speak. It's a very old-fashioned formulation about the universalizing power of the literary. What does the literary do? As Jonathan Culler reminds us, one forgets when one does theory that the first part of the term is called literary theory. Where is the literary in literary theory? It seems to have everything but the literary. You have sociology, you have history, you have quantum mechanics from a Marxist point of view. And finally, if you ask them, is that a sonnet? How do I know? Who cares? It is all about privilege of the quantum physicist and funding from the CSIR. That we all understand. But nobody knows whether it's a sonnet to start with and how many syllables does that have in a sentence. But never mind. Third, accounting for the ways in which texts mutate. And this to me is Siskin's most important point in an otherwise rather routine essay. Accounting for the ways in which texts mutate as they travel across cultures and languages and therefore elude the generic fixity of yesteryear. This is why I invoked Walcott's reinscription of the epic for his own purposes, for what he wants to do. As Baba once famously put it in an interview, I use the language I need to do the work I need to do. No? Fair enough. And therefore, people like Siskin and others, and I'm thinking here in terms of Vaidik Bhattacharya's novel formations, the Indian origins of a European genre, and Sneharika Roy's The Post-Colonial Epic from Melville to Walcott and Ghosh, as pioneering works in this area. The Bildungsroman, the ghost tale, magical realist texts, even the ghazal, travel narratives are reconfigured genres that are at once post-colonial and global. That's the point I want to emphasize for reasons that should emerge soon. People argue that the post-colonial author takes a form, the novel, which is always already there from a Western tradition. Fair enough. One doesn't dispute that. But that the genre has mutated, as I illustrated with the example from Rushdie or Marquez or George Louis Borges, what they do with it. But you also tend to forget that when you say the novel is a Western form, the novel didn't stay in one form even in the West. Even in the Western novel form, there are multiple variations and appropriations. So when you say the Western novel, I don't know what you mean. You mean the early picaresque novel, Alan Rob Grillet's experimental fiction, B.S. Johnson's shuffle novel, which you read by shuffling the pages around. It's not bound. To go back to that old joke, Prometheus unbound, $10, bound 15. So the shuffle novel is a novel which comes where you can shuffle the pages around and read any which way. It's not fixed. So you can read it in any sequence you want. What about those? Or think of House of Leaves. You are not quite sure whether it's a philosophical tract on unreadable Heideggers or a novel. So when you say the Western novel is something the post-colonial author appropriated, you are not quite sure which Western novel we are talking about. Because the Western novel itself is multiform, varied, uneven. Perspective, tone, diction, style, structure, they have all been modified by authors who found that the traditional novel is not good enough for what they want to do. And when you think in terms of appropriations like what we now discover, varying forms, like the Edinburgh Companion points out, there is something like a neoliberal Gothic, there's a diabetic Gothic. I'm not joking. There's a full essay on sugar and the American Gothic. There are medical Gothic texts, of course. There is, as I know, at least one book called The Transplantation Gothic, which is not about the Gothic being transplanted, but about transplantation horrors, which is appropriating the Gothic form. Then there is, of course, the cyberpunk Gothic, variations of it. So which Gothic are we referring to? As though these are monolithic forms. No, so the Western novel was never monolithic in itself, which is basically why texts like, Sneharika Roy and Vaidik Bhattacharya are trying to demonstrate that their own origins are multiple. That when you say the English novel didn't develop out of itself alone, not sui generis. It borrowed, it adapted. And the postcolonial is doing likewise. There is no monopoly on form. There might be monopoly on cultural productions of the form, but the form itself is uneven, takes multiple variations. So you need to start thinking in terms of where these texts the Bildungsroman, the Gothic tale, magic realist text are being appropriated. Think in terms of the variation between, say, Ben Okri's magical realism and the kind of work that Rushdie does. Think in terms of Marquez's magical realist texts and Rushdie. Would you think of all of them as just magical realist, or are there variations that you need to account for? This, I think, is crucial, because the genre's mutations also keep the genre alive. It is what traditional theory would refer to as repetition with a difference. They don't repeat in exactly the same way. And appropriations are important because it's also at some point a certain, shall we say, indigenization of these. There are other things I would like to bring in here. And that leads me to the next point. The question to be asked, perhaps, is what is the ethics of IWE or postcolonial that makes it global and universal? Such a question would be necessarily directed at domains such as social justice, human rights, environmental crises, neo-imperialism, without detracting from studies of IWE postcolonial aesthetics and form. And this brings us to the point where you ask whether there's a rise of an oxymoronic construction like the global indigene. By definition, indigene can't be global. But the investment in global indigeneity, subaltern, ethnic, marginalized, oppressed groups from all over the world, is also a cultural industry and has given rise to forms, texts, and themes all over the world. And there is a very strong investment in this. It implies the role that these literary texts, the power that these literary texts have in what you can think of as transnational civil society's activism. And the rise of a transnational human rights movement has been facilitated by an investment, a cultural investment in the global indigene. I am not at this point getting into the authenticity debate. It bores me to near-death situations because I don't think anybody understands that authenticity is primarily an authenticity effect. That effect is generated by the form and language of a text. You can't say this text is authentic. No, it has a certain authenticating device or devices which produce a certain kind of effect. Whether this text is authentic or not, to me, is a rather silly question. I only want to know whether it generates an effect of authenticity. And there are authenticating devices that all texts use and employ with varying degrees of success. That goes without saying, which is why my point about the aesthetic and formal properties of any text. So when you think in terms of the global indigene, the questions to be asked include what are the authenticating devices that these use. For instance, we do know that postcolonial literature in the global marketing scene, in the global cultural production scene, is another variation of ethnic chic. Like paneer tikka goes global, like Turkish carpets go global, so does the postcolonial text. All for consumption. Whether it's food or the author, they're part of a larger global cultural process. So the postcolonial and the IWE offer are part of a global ethnic chic, fashionable, trendy, academically respectable, reviewed in, say, The Guardian or New York Times, referenced by major critics, widely read, dramatized on BBC, whatever it might be. There are multiple levels at which these operate. And of course, the literary festivals and awards. The point I'm making is that the investment in the global indigene and the global circulation of the trauma narrative is central to the consumption of IWE and the postcolonial. Again, I am not disputing here whether the trauma is authentic or not. I'm not interested. But I'm definitely interested in how it gets manufactured in a text and how it gets marketed outside the text. Trauma sells. Nothing sells like trauma. We know that. Which is why, as I think it was Elie Wiesel who said, every century has its genres. The Greeks had their tragedy, we have the memoir. It is. The tragedy memoir is the largest selling genre of the 20th century. And the emphasis on global indigeneity, which, like I said, is an oxymoronic construction, means that the cultural production and the cultural consumption of indigeneity, which would be about the trauma of indigenous tribes, the problems of social justice, climate refugees, migrant labor and migrant populations, diasporic disenfranchisement, all of those. And to me, it's important to recognize that this is where the global South brushes up against the first world and bleeds, to borrow Gloria Anzaldua's famous description of the Mexican-US border, where the third world rushes up against the first world and bleeds. But it's not a one-way transaction, a one-way process. Everybody benefits. So global indigeneity is also part, and we would not be very wise to ignore it, a part of the global cultural manufacture and consumption of ethnic chic. You also see IWE intersecting with the global, and it's something worth exploring, whether new and forthcoming concerns are a part of it, which will make it further global. So we have already covered the ground about indigeneity and their problems, but also does it express and work with, say, post-humanist concerns alongside world literature? Does it address environmental crisis in any fashion that we recognize and which the globe recognizes? I am not proposing that the third world writer, and this is the usual charge leveled against the third world global South writer, that they're writing for Western audiences alone. No, I'm not saying that. I am here adapting the argument made by Lisa Lau in an early essay from 2007 called Reorientalism, where Orientalizing and Orientalisms are not practiced by the white author about the global South alone, but an Orientalizing done by global South authors about their own nations, about their own cultures, ethnic chic, in other words. And the reorientalizing, which of course hinges upon the global indigene and the cultural investment in the global indigene, very often brings into a discussion, literary discussion here, I'm not speaking about non-fictional prose, concerns that intersect with the global. Migration, for instance, climate change. So it's important to also ask, and this is something I mentioned before, what is universalizable about these texts? Where are these texts located vis-a-vis global concerns, global themes, global matters which are political, economic, and others? So how does IWE intersect with post-humanist concerns, say, in world literature, if it does at all? Genres as diverse as sci-fi to gothic, the graphic novel as a form to poetry. I don't know about theater and drama. It's a genre I avidly avoid, so I'll not comment about it. Which you see the adaptations coming out of. But to me, common concerns like human rights or environmental crisis, two areas I'm moderately familiar with, or neo-imperialism, do demonstrate that intersection. And to me, post-colonial and IWE's emphasis on global indigeneity and the investment in ethnic chic is not just a question of trend or fashionable themes. It is what it is precisely because it intersects with larger global concerns, what I refer to as transnational civil society activism. It feeds into that. It's not for nothing that these, what are called communities of concern and communities of interest emerge into being. And here, of course, where matters of concern, MOCs as they are called, merge into matters of care. And that's where the post-colonial text makes its presence felt. It does brush up against the first world and bleed. Yes, it does. But it also, as a consequence, has a particular kind of effect. Finally, what aesthetics adapted from post-colonial world literatures find expression, modification, and adaptation in the Indian writings that we are interested in English. I return to Baidik Bhattacharya's and Sneharika Roy's works on the post-colonial epic and novel formations, the Indian origins of a European genre. When you look at the early work of someone like Srinivas Aramudan, he spoke about the fact that the English novel actually came out of other European literary traditions. They didn't come out of England or Europe in a particular location. They came out of multiple traditions. IWE is not an exception to that. For me, the entanglements, a very fashionable word thanks to Donna Haraway's otherwise unreadable prose, is useful because of that particular locational mess, which is productive. Where does this draw from? I'm not thinking here in terms of the Bloomian theory of influence, the influence of anxiety or the anxiety of influence. I'm thinking in terms of a co-production, that texts, themes, authors, of course, draw upon multiple sources. And it's not possible, I think, any longer to disentangle those sources. All texts arrive with the possibility of translatability, as Rebecca Walkowitz will speak about when she writes about world literatures. They arrive with the potential for translatability. But as she also notes, some texts arrive already translated because they've already taken on other forms, other texts, other linguistic and discursive registers, so that it's no longer possible to say this comes from here and that comes from there. I also don't think it's all that important. The pursuit of origins and pure lines are extremely risky. Contemporary India is a case in point about that. To search for true origins, true lineages is worrying. And to do that in literature is a mug's game. And for Indian writing in English, which as we have seen, you see sources everywhere. When you look at how many languages and linguistic registers Raja Ram Mohan Roy was familiar with, or Tagore's incredible erudition. Where do you locate Tagore's origins as a writer? Why would you even set out to do such a thing? Aesthetic forms being translated and translatable poses, of course, other kinds of problems. In the sense, how exactly is the adaptation done? Are these in consonance with or differing from global concerns? Like I said, environmental crisis or ideas of human rights or social justice. How exactly does the epic get transformed in, say, Derek Walcott or Amitav Ghosh? Those pose some problems because examining formal properties is very tiring, which is why if you pay attention to your own syllabi and your teaching or your classes, we are very happy discussing post-colonial themes. Nobody discusses post-colonial form. We all discuss themes, whether it is partition literature or whether it's X, Y, or Z poets. We're very happy discussing themes, but we very rarely want to address the question of form because that requires a little more work, and by definition, we don't want to work. I keep forgetting that it's going up on the web. I think a lot of editing will have to be done. But think about that. Think of how the form transforms when you consume, when you produce. And to me, the necessity of addressing these, and those who work on things like the graphic novel know how, say, Bhima and I has broken the boundaries of the form, but the gardener in the wasteland did not. Unevenness of text is not necessarily a disadvantage. Very often it points to the incompleteness of the form or its malleability. And to me, that's one of the big advantages of those who are writing interesting stuff, producing interesting work in IWE, whether criticism or literary texts, because they are so attentive to questions of the form. I'm going to stop here. I'm tired. Thank you.
So you mentioned the fact that identity is increasingly a part of curricula across the world, especially in the global north. How much of it has to do with the fact that there is practically no major university in the global north which does not have academics at influential positions from either of Indian origin, or they could be from the global south. So, for example, the Humanities Center at Harvard was funded by the Mahindras, for example, with Homi Bhabha as the director. And you have similar centers funded by people like the Ambanis or the Mittals elsewhere, in either in America or in Europe. So how much of this curricularization has to do with the fact that there are people from the global south at influential positions in global north?
That's a fascinating point. Arif Derlich, in a very early essay called The Postcolonial Aura, made the point that postcolonialism begins with the arrival of the third world academic in the first world academia. He was referring to Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, the first trinity in postcolonial studies. It's a very simple point, apparently, that postcolonialism begins with the arrival of the third world academic in the first world academia. And yes, he's more or less accurate about it. The job market, the journal publication, which, as Narayan Chandran always constantly reminds us, is also a very specific cultural production that determines the shape of criticism. And that because he always draws attention to who owns journals, who are the editorial board members, how do they circulate. These are controlled originally by non-Asian global south academics, and now increasingly that power has shifted. So if you think in terms of the number of postcolonial journals coming out, that is part of this large loop which is built into this. Mahindra, of course, will not fund a chair at University of Hyderabad. We have enough chairs. Some are like these, but they will fund it at Harvard. So there is the curricularization process is bankrolled, one, but it's also to do with the cultural prestige of funding the humanities, which by definition, as Eagleton has pointed out early, literature remains the queen of the humanities. And as I said, I mean queen in the traditional sense. Yes, it is bankrolled, but there's also a lot of cultural prestige. And the global emphasis on the humanities has proved to be advantageous, which is where this comes in. So you don't see the Mahindra Institute for Rocket Science. It's still the humanities. So the emphasis on the humanities and its global significance as they are seeing it has proved to be advantageous. The other is also a shift because of the, and this is not provable, how many doctorates in Asian literatures are being produced by the global north annually. It's worth thinking about because they then get back into the system and you teach the post-colonial or global south courses or whatever it might be. So I do not think, and I would see that as part of the cultural production, that the funding of chairs, scholarships to study these courses, programs are part of the much larger, what Dipesh Chakravarti earlier referred to as provincialization. So you see that originally as a small entry point and now as integral to this. You also see clusters and specializations emerging in those curricula, where you have these ones coming in. And then you have, to make it a more academic take on this, you look at things like, you have a global concept like the Anthropocene, and now you begin to narrow it down to the global south and the Anthropocene. Soon it will be Telangana and the Anthropocene, or Gachibowli's Anthropocene. You never know. I mean, the literary critic is very good at the additive impulse. You start making finer and finer points till you look at everything and say, oh, there's nothing here. That's because you chopped away everything. I see the necessity of the local, but I am not quite sure I understand how you can narrow it down to that level and still speak of an Anthropocene. But never mind, I'm not an ethnographer, nor do I plan to be. So there are those curricular dimensions which do have a very strong lineage with, say, industrial house funding, But also, like I said, the journal and publisher linkages, who's publishing what. Think in terms of publishing houses. I forget what it's called, the Global Asian Initiative, which it is a publishing initiative with Columbia, Princeton, Chicago coming together to publish a series on Asian subjects. And this Rebecca Walkowitz's book was one of the first to appear in that. Now, that is an industry too, isn't it? The publishing house. And when you have a prestigious line like, and this has editors, editorial board members like Deepesh Chakravarti, Spivak, and others sitting on it. So 4-5 titles. The series wound up after that, if I'm right. But that's a huge thing. I mean, you're marketing Asia from the top publishing houses in the world. Surely you cannot deny that it has a certain cultural prestige, which will market the syllabus in a different fashion as well. Yes. It's interesting to study that. But I'm not quite sure how we can study that. I mean, you won't know the nitty-gritties of how they're put together at this center. Though the Mahindra Humanities Center is doing astonishing work. Their lecture series is brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah.